Today's conversation is with Thea Silver. I've known Thea for probably 20 years. We met when she was working at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Thea's had a really interesting career. I'm not sure where she was before Nature Conservancy, but she then went into the philanthropic side of sustainability, where she was a funder. And she has also currently working at Royal Bank of Canada. So somebody from an NGO sector becoming a funder and then working in the corporate sector. It'll be a really interesting episode.
Hi everyone, my name is Alexis Brownlee and I'm a student at the University of Guelph. Welcome to Career Conversations, a podcast where we explore different career paths and hear from professionals about their experiences and insights in their fields. On today's episode, we'll be discussing careers in environmental sustainability and the role that large organizations can play in creating positive environmental change. Let's jump into my conversation with today's guest. Today I am joined by Thea Silver. She is the Senior Director of Environmental Impact at the Royal Bank of Canada. Thank you for being here today. My first question is if you could talk a bit about your educational background and how you got your first job in your desired field.
So I did an undergrad at McGill. I took a course that was called Ecology and Animal Behavior or something like that. And it just clicked. I loved it. I loved the professor. I loved the content. That sort of started my path. And after McGill, I wasn't sure. I did a master's, which brought me to Guelph. I was looking at changes in environmental heavy metals and acidification on waterfowl. So I was always interested in that applied aspect of the work. And when I finished my master's, I threw my resume into a bunch of positions for field work and eventually got a call from a place out in Manitoba, actually called Delta Waterfowl, which focused on training graduate students in waterfowl and wetland research. I kind of all of a sudden packed up my bags and moved to the middle of nowhere, Manitoba, for what I thought would be a summer, and it turned into a year. But it was probably one of the best moves I could have made because it opened up all sorts of paths for me.
Wow, that's incredible. And that's quite a far move from Guelph to Manitoba to just relocate for the summer, but it sounds like that worked out very well.
Yeah, it absolutely did.
Yes. And my next question is, could you tell me a bit about your role currently and what you're doing at the Royal Bank of Canada and what that position entails?
So my job now, I oversee all of the community investments. So that is sort of the bank's support of charities and not-for-profits doing community-led environmental work. So after a year of living in the middle of nowhere, Manitoba, I ended up coming back to Toronto and working with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I spent about 13 or 14 years with the Nature Conservancy of Canada.
Wow.
And then I worked with another conservation organization that kind of was the association supporting a number of land trusts across the country. So I worked in conservation in the charitable sector for close to 20 years. And about 12 years ago, I thought if I'm ever going to make a change, it would be to move over to the funding side of things and look at how can philanthropy and funding really support and drive and influence that work. So I eventually got a job with a foundation called the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and I helped to design and oversee their environment strategy. Then worked with a network of funders called Environment Funders Canada for a number of years until this opportunity to sort of bring my experience working in the not-for-profit sector together with my experience in philanthropy and drive the environmental donations and philanthropy of the biggest company in Canada. The bank is the largest company in Canada, and it has probably one of the largest corporate funders right across the charitable sector. I oversee and direct the strategy of everything that we do from a donation kind of community investment standpoint in the environment space. And it sees us supporting nonprofits and charities working on climate mitigation solutions. So there's a lot of nonprofits that are looking at how can we decarbonize, build efficiency, build, climate resilience in some of these highest emitting sectors. And then we also support a lot of nature-based work, really looking at nature's inherent ability to help sequester carbon, but also contribute to adaptation and resilience and nature-based solutions. So we work and support a lot of charities working in that space as well. So I like to say I've got the best job in the bank. You never think you'd start off as a wildlife biologist and end up working at a bank, but I've always continued to work in that environment space, either if not actually working with the environmental organizations, which I did for a good part of my career, now working to fund and support the work that they do and the impact they can have. It has been a really windy road and interesting trajectory. You know, I mentioned to you that I started working at a waterfowl and wetlands organization. And when I was doing policy work there, it led me, I was doing a lot of research on sort of legislative tools to conserve land. And that ended up connecting me with a lot of not-for-profit land conservation organizations. And eventually I ended up, after a year of living in the middle of nowhere, Manitoba, I ended up coming back to Toronto and working with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which a lot of folks may know now. When I joined it a long time ago, it was still, it was a large organization at the time, but still, you know, much smaller than it is today. And I spent a long time. I spent about 13 or 14 years with the Nature Conservancy of Canada.
Wow.
And then I worked with another conservation organization that kind of was the association supporting a number of land trusts across the country. So all these land conservation organizations are called land trusts, and I helped lead the association that supports them. So I worked in conservation, you know, directly in the charitable sector for close to 20 years. And about 12 years ago, I thought if I'm ever going to make a change, it would be to move over to the funding side of things and look at how can philanthropy and funding really support and drive and influence that work. So I eventually got a job with a foundation called the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and I helped to design and oversee their environment strategy. I then worked with a network of funders called Environment Funders Canada for a number of years until this opportunity to sort of bring my experience working in the not-for-profit sector together with my experience in philanthropy and drive the environmental donations and philanthropy of the biggest company in Canada. So banks are very, very confusing places, especially when you come in as a wildlife biologist. I work within a team called Sustainability and Impact, which is a function of the banks. On a typical day, there's about 5 of us. So I'm a small team within a larger team of about 60. But my team on a typical day, I may have some meetings with community partners. So we support a budget that's about close to $30 million a year. So it's a significant amount of money that we grant for both national projects and regional projects. Sometimes I will have meetings with partners along with my staff where we're either getting updates on the work they're doing, or perhaps we're having discussions about proposals they may want to make. They want to learn more about our strategy. We want to learn more about our work, see if there's alignment and a fit. Sometimes, you know, on a day, I might spend time actually with colleagues working in climate and sustainability across the bank, and looking at, are there synergies between some of the work that we're supporting through community investment, which is all sort of about that community environmental impact, but it might connect with some interests of the bank. Like we have a program we support through our philanthropy that's really looking at how small and medium-sized businesses can measure their carbon and take steps to address it. Well, the bank has clients that are interested in that. How can they learn from that work? So sometimes we will, you know, the business never drives what we do in the environment space and the philanthropy, but it can, you know, there can be synergies and our partners can learn from that as well. So I will have a lot of internal meetings. So it's a real combination of working internally and externally. Almost every day is somewhat different, to be quite honest. Banks you think might not be aligned with what you're doing, but it's been fascinating to learn internally how much alignment there is, how much is happening right across the bank to use its business, its own operations, its employees, and its community investments that I am involved with to kind of make progress on big issues that are important.
Yes, that is nice. My next question for you is, what have been some of your greatest accomplishments or most rewarding moments in your career so far?
I'm in that sort of sunset of my career, I hope. And there's been a number of, I've been really fortunate to work in something right across my career that I care about. And I think no matter what career path you go down, it's unlikely you will love your job every day. There will be times that you don't. There will be times you don't like what you're doing. But in the big picture, I've always wanted to work in something I care about, and I feel that I'm making some kind of difference. Early in my days in conservation, just being part of when I was with the Nature Conservancy, being part of overseeing programs and projects that actually have lasting conservation impact on the ground. Like, you can visit these places, you can touch them. And I might not have been doing that direct negotiation with the landowner, but I was involved in moving it ahead. I supported at one point in my career the direct establishment of a nature reserve in northern Newfoundland, and that was just such accomplishment. Like, I kind of go, that place exists because of some work that I was directly involved with. And then I did some government relations at one point when I was with Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I was directly involved in supporting some changes to tax law, believe it or not, that made it easier for people to donate land. So that, the fact that that is easier now and there is no tax disincentive, I wasn't solely responsible, but I was directly involved in that work. Same with another partnership we had developed with the federal government that saw $200 million being donated, sort of a contribution to NCC and the work of other conservation organizations. I spent about 5 years kind of doing government relations leading up to that big announcement and that big investment of money that's become sort of the precursor to a number of programs that Environment Canada has supported. Wow. That was kind of cool. And then as a funder, I think, I've been involved in developing the community investment or the donation strategy for a couple fairly large funders, and knowing that I had a hand to bring my perspective in to help influence what it funds and how it funds, particularly at the bank. When we look at nature-based work, I had done a lot of learning about, actually part of it started at University of Guelph with something called the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which was all about how we can uplift and support Indigenous leadership and rights in conservation. And I've brought that lens into how we engage in nature-based solutions at the bank. So, it's all still a work in progress, but that's sort of, I think, a few things that I've been proud of over my career.
Yes, it sounds like very fulfilling.
It has been.
As a student who's graduating soon, I definitely want a career where I can have that fulfillment. It sounds like you've had a lot of that throughout your career, which is very great.
Yeah, but it's a windy path to get there. Like, that's,
yes.
When I meet people now, and I said this to my kids too, because I've got I've got kids that are similar age to you. I've said, don't wait for that one perfect job. Like, the path can take you in interesting places. And with every place you go, you learn. So, if someone had told me I would take my first job basically being paid nothing and move out to the middle of nowhere, Manitoba, I would have said, no offense to north of Portage la Prairie. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
I would have kind of gone, oh, really? But that move opened up a number of things for me, even if it wasn't exactly what I wanted to be doing. I had no idea what I wanted to be doing. I still sometimes am not sure. I just sort of follow the path that I've kind of carved out.
Yes. Okay, my next question is, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced along the way, and how did you overcome them?
That's always a tricky question.
Yes.
I think some challenges right throughout my career is you're going to always work with people whose perspective or opinions may be different than yours, and being willing to open up, step back, kind of listen and learn and not dig in, or at least know when to dig in and when not to. And I don't know if there's a perfect answer to that. But I think, that is always a challenge when you're working in anything that involves multi-stakeholders and multi-perspectives. So, I mentioned that project in Newfoundland that I was involved with, that we worked with a small community in northern Newfoundland to establish a nature reserve, but the land that was potentially going to be used for this nature reserve, the community actually used to get some gravel for their driveways. So we had to work through some issues, and I had to go up to Newfoundland in winter to sit down at their table and look at how can we work things out. And it might, you never want to let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
And just be willing to listen to someone else's perspective. So I think that, I don't know if that's a challenge or just a way of working. It's always challenging in the sector that sometimes you feel like there aren't a lot of jobs and then they may not pay well. That's changing, I think, quite a lot, at least in the not-for-profit sector. But I think I overcame that by being willing to take chances and sort of see where the path would take me versus waiting for, I mentioned this already, waiting for, okay, I really want to be here doing that. Well, I might not be able to, I might not be able to be here doing that right now. So let's look at something different that's going to build soft skills, maybe, that I might be able to apply in a different way. So I think, being open-minded and thinking not only of I'm qualified to do this, there could be all different opportunities out there. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but that's what you get right now.
In my class, my professor was talking about us going into the workforce and looking at different jobs, and he was like, you're going to have to sacrifice one of three things. One of them is going to be the location of the job,
Yep.
one of them is going to be the pay, and one of them is going to be the job itself. But every job will give you something.
So that I completely agree with him him or her on that. Absolutely. I think in my first job I sacrificed at least two of those, but got one.
My next question is, if you could speak to your 22-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself about working in this career space? Or what advice would you offer to young professionals entering the field today?
I think I touched on some of the advice about the windy road and being very open-minded and, not waiting for that perfect opportunity, seeing where something might take you. I think that's a big piece of advice. I mean, part of me in my if I was talking to my 22-year-old self, I mean, I might have said maybe start in something that might have benefits and a pension, but that never guided me.
Yeah.
I'm at an age now that I look at my brother who has had that his whole career, and he's going to retire with that, and I won't. But you know what? I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade what I've done for anything. So you always need to be able to support yourself, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
But just find those opportunities when you're young. As you get older, it gets harder to say, okay, I'm going to pick up and move here, or I'm going to do that. Now, some people are very good at that, but I've experienced, and I have I was always a working woman with a pretty busy career and a family, and I found that gets a little bit harder. But the other thing I think is a piece of advice that I've followed or been able to is we find our own balance. And I know there's a lot of talk now, as there should be, about life-work balance. And I prioritize it, and I think it's important. But I think people need to create it themselves as well. And I've had people in my life, colleagues and personally, some where they're their own worst enemy. Like there's always more work to do than will get done in a day. And some people are better at handling that than others. So, I've seen folks that they'll work all night every night because they've got to get this done. And sometimes that's the case, but that's not always the case. I think, I would always say to people, there's got to be time that you're able to say, I just can't do this right now, or I have to do this. I mean, hey, there will be times, and there were times in my career that I was working an awful lot. But that will end. You do what you have to do, but you find your own balance. So I guess that's a word of advice as well.
Anyways, those were all my questions for you today. Thank you so much for sharing. It's been very interesting hearing about your career and your life experiences.
Okay. Nice meeting you. Bye-bye.